the corruptness of the American prison system and its cultural and social conflicts. The United States currently has the highest national incarceration rate at about 4.4% of total U.S. people and is responsible for about 22% of prisoners worldwide. The United States focuses on punishment rather than enacting rehabilitation policies. Therefore, it is common for prisoners to return to these institutions, but without any behavioral change. In different areas of the country, different races are more prevalent than others and more populous. African Americans are incarcerated nearly 6 times the amount of whites. It is projected that if African Americans and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rate as whites, the current American incarceration rate would decrease by 50%. But why does this happen? Some would argue because of modern-day racism towards minority groups. Another possible reason for the significantly higher incarceration rate of minorities is because of inner-city crime, being that minorities do tend to cluster together in inner cities. Just like all other groups of people, there is a hierarchy among the inmates in the United States prison systems. At the top of the food chain would be gang leaders and then gang members. These prison gangs are usually formed against differing racial groups. Below the gang members are the run-of-the-mill prisoners, who have no gang affiliation. It is expected of them to respect the gang members but to not interfere. Below these inmates are the prisoners incarcerated for crimes such as rape and sexual offenses towards children. And at the very bottom of the food chain are the snitches. It is strongly against prison etiquette to report a fellow inmate to staff. It has been found that incarcerated Americans typically have a much lower income compared to non-incarcerated Americans. In 2014, incarcerated people had a median annual income of $19,185 prior to their incarceration, which is 41% less than non-incarcerated people of similar ages. All incarcerated genders, ethnicities, and races earned significantly less before being incarcerated compared to their non-incarcerated counterparts of similar age. It has also been proven that most incarcerated Americans, 57%, have an average income of less than $22,500 a year, while 57% of non-incarcerated Americans have an income of more than $37,500 a year. Therefore, there is an obvious correlation between poverty and incarceration. The United States consistently sends large amounts of poor people to prison with low education and low career skills, and sends them back out into their community with an even lower chance of economic success. It is up to the federal, state, and local governments to repeal laws hindering the economic success of freed American prisoners. They can do this by repealing laws restricting incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people's access to welfare, public housing, Pell Grants, and student loans, and U.S. citizens can end their discrimination against people with criminal convictions. Nearly a third, or 32%, of federal prisoners return to prison within 5 years of their release to community supervision, compared to more than half, or 59%, of the state prisoners, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. One study tracked 404,638 prisoners in 30 states after their release from prison in 2005 and found that after 3 years of release back into the public community, 67.8% of former prisoners were rearrested. This is enough evidence to signal that rehabilitation services in U.S. prisons are not efficient or successful. Until the mid-1970s, rehabilitation services were largely implemented in U.S. prisons. However, now the initiative to get tough on crime has taken over the focus of rehabilitation services to prisoners. Many prisoners have mental illnesses, as many as 20% in some prisons. Encouraging positive mental health is beneficial for all prisoners, mentally ill or not, and unfortunately, mental health is not a huge focus in U.S. prisons anymore. However, one positive attribute of the U.S. prison system is that psychiatrists and psychologists are usually provided, and these services can help out drug addicts as well as providing support to inmates attempting to return back into the public community. But these specialists have very heavy caseloads and cannot always take the time to work with prisoners as much as needed, further proving the emphasis on punishment over the element of rehabilitation. 1/5 of American prisoners report they have been assaulted by a fellow prisoner or guard. 66% of sexual misconduct by prison staff involve inmates who willingly agree. Both of these forms of misconduct have to do with the concept of deviance, violating a social norm. This means that women and men who have sexual relations with prison staff feel pressure because of the prison hierarchy set in place, the inmates being below the staff. They don't want to violate the norm or social hierarchy, therefore they take part in what they think is normal. As for the physical abuse, when one inmate threatens a higher-up inmate's authority, the outcome usually leads to violence. Different geographical areas of the country calls for different amounts of annual costs for the U.S. prisoner. For example, in New York City, it costs $167,731 to hold one inmate annually. Vermont, New Jersey, and Connecticut are some of the most expensive annual state fees for the average prisoner. It is interesting that these northern states have higher economic costs per prisoner compared to rural western states like Utah and Idaho. This is probably because of less inner-city violent crimes and less connections to drugs and gang affiliations. More money is going towards staffing and expanding correctional facilities than toward the K-12 American student. Mandating psychologists and psychiatrists for all prisoners for a specified amount of time a week can have a positive effect on inmates. Also, installing classroom settings in all prisons will allow inmates to educate themselves and their peers. There have been a few programs that have been proven successful, including Pathways to Hope Prison Dog Project, allowing inmates to work with unwanted dogs, thus teaching them a greater sense of responsibility. Another program called PrEP donates thousands of books to inmates in New York and strives to teach inmates enhanced literacy, making the transition to release from prison easier and of more opportunities. But above all, we must shift the focus back onto rehabilitation rather than ensuring those who should be punished are in fact punished. Focusing on the rehabilitation aspect will cause less men and women to re-enter our prison systems, leading to less punishment. There are more prisons operating in the United States today than any other country on earth. U.S. taxpayers spend a grand total of $60 billion on the prison system each year. The current U.S. prison system is a failed system. It is a discriminatory system that does almost nothing to ensure inmates do not return. The system makes billions and billions of dollars off inmates each year. In order to reform the system, transforming negative behavior must be the number one priority, and the initiative to get tough on crime cannot be the main focus. As citizens, we must embrace others of differing races and ethnicities in society. Mental health therapy must once again be a huge element of prisoner rehabilitation in order to better prisoners for life outside of bars. We must come together as a country, or else the prison system will only continue to house a significantly higher rate of minorities with a negative outlook on the U.S. correctional services.